Hello, hello, hi. I'm Kelly Kivlin. I'm an associate curator here at DIA. Thank you all for coming this evening. This is actually the first Artist and Artist of the season, and I think it's wonderful that we have Daniel Joseph Martinez speaking on Joseph Beuys. Just for those that don't know, the Artist and Artists lecture series is a part of the Sackler Institute here at DIA Art Foundation. And the support for the series is also provided by public funds from the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs. And I'd also like to thank Brooklyn Brewery, of course, for the cold beverages. And last, I want to extend a very warm thank you to my colleagues here who make this series possible. And that would include Francesca Logabo, Max Sinone, and Mary Catherine Youngblood. In 1982, DIA facilitated the realization of Joseph Beuys' proposal for Documenta, titled 7,000 Eichen, or 7,000 Oaks. It was a project that called for the planting of 7,000 trees, each paired with a basalt marker. And this was placed throughout the city of Kassel, Germany. It took several decades, actually, well, several years to complete. But also in 1988, as part of an inauguration of DIA's Center for the Arts, which was across the street at 548 West 22nd Street, 5 trees and columns were installed in front of that building. It also extended 7,000 Oaks to the United States for the first time. In 1996, DIA extended this installation to stretch the entire block of 22nd Street between 10th and 11th Avenue. And of course, that work still exists today. When DIA Beacon opened in 2003, several works by Boyce were installed, including the encyclopedic work Arena, which includes a collection of 100 panels of photographs taken over the span of his career up to 1972, as well as Ostberlin from 1979, a stage-like installation informed by his infamous one-week installation, I Like America and America Likes Me, which was at René Block Gallery in 1974. It is now my pleasure to introduce Daniel Joseph Martinez. Martinez's practice spans close to 4 decades and has actively questioned the social, political, and cultural conventions, creating work that has been described as nonlinear, asymmetrical, and multidimensional propositions. For the Whitney Biennial in 1993, Martinez realized the project, quote, "I can't imagine ever wanting to be white," end quote, a text that appeared in fragments on appropriate museum admission pins, very similar to the DIA pins you have today. Now a well-known work, Martinez's statement is as relevant to discuss today as it was 25 years ago. Recently, Martinez's work was included in the Pacific Standard Time LA exhibition Home, So Different, So Appealing at Los Angeles County Museum of Art. And his current exhibition, quote, I Am Ulrike Meinhof, or Someone Once Told Me That Time is a Flat Circle, end quote, at Robertson Tilton in Los Angeles, received a wonderful acclaim recently. And he lives and works in Los Angeles, and he's also been a longtime professor at the University of California, Irvine. Please join me in welcoming Daniel Joseph Martinez.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for coming tonight on this auspicious occasion. Just give me one moment here, please. I would, perhaps some acknowledgements first. I would like to thank DIA and Kelly for their very generous and kind invitation for having me be here tonight. It's quite something for me to be back in New York. I mean, I come to New York all the time, but there's something about presenting Boyce at this particular moment that's perhaps is useful. In the course of preparing for this talk tonight, Kelly and I have had quite a number of quite engaging conversations, including her coming out to Los Angeles to visit me to talk even in more depth, not so much necessarily specifically about Boyce himself, but simply ideas and intersections and places where we have commonality in thinking about things contemporarily, things that are intergenerational, notions of performativity, how these things are affecting us contemporarily. It occurred to me in thinking about this that I'm not sure exactly how other artists have gone in selecting someone from the collection. Basically, the way this works, if you're not familiar, is that you're asked to speak, and then you pick an artist out of the collection, and then you come up with a solution, inevitably, to address that artist in some particular manner. And I can't speak to how other artists have done that, but I had mentioned to Kelly on a number of occasions that it's not coincidence that I'm here now and at this moment, and that I'm speaking on Boyce, because I actually don't believe in coincidence. I think it has to do with timing. Timing is something that is much more precise. Timing implies precision, and timing implies a narrative, and timing implies an objective. And some of the coincidences that could have occurred, perhaps maybe it's a will, it's a way of being in the world that the timing of things allows you to then be able to speak to them in a way that you were not able to speak to them previously. So for me, there's moments that have arrived. So 1974, when Boyce came to America, well, 1974, I was 16 years old, and it was when I went to California Institute of the Arts. It was when I began going to art school. So as Boyce was coming to America, I was going into art school. And my education I need to mention that because I'm going to speak about education tonight in relation to Boyce. And I had a somewhat eclectic and very fortunate education. I went to Cal Arts at the height of Cal Arts conceptualism, in other words, West Coast conceptualism. My teachers were Michael Asher. We had begun post-studio in 1974, so the notion of post-studio cycling around and around and around again through the decades is sort of entertaining, right? I had Douglas Hubler as a teacher. I had John Baldessari as a teacher, right? It was the dovetail of feminism being pushed out of Cal Arts and the rise of male conceptualism at the time. And this is something that needs to be noted, because Cal Arts began as a multifaceted proposition. West Coast conceptualism, these were the fathers, at one point the fathers and mothers of West Coast conceptualism, augmenting what had happened in the East Coast and augmenting what had been inherited from Europe. The other thing that happened simultaneous to that would be that Herbert Marcuse was teaching at UC San Diego. So my Marxism comes directly from Marcuse. And it's important because that's the Marxism that one gets to understand is a functional Marxism. In other words, he would introduce us to the Frankfurt School. And the Frankfurt School in particular, if we're looking at Adorno is useful for us to think about the times that we live in now. It is perhaps, and maybe it's imperative that we think about how Adorno thought about the time, or how the Frankfurt School was an anti-fascist position in relation to the war. So then, out of, again, I wonder sometimes if desire can manifest something. If you think about something that you need, something that you want, a way that you want to move in the world, that you want to be able to focus your attention on something that is unattainable, something that is not possible. Is it possible? Can it be done? Can a kind of Nietzschean will to power manifest itself? I think so, because at this exact moment in 1980, I met Klaus Rinke. And Klaus Rinke was the protege of Boyce. He was the #1 pupil of Boyce. So I could have never received information more directly than I had coming from Rinke. In fact, it's almost intravenous. It's like heroin. Rinke was this giant man with a kind of German afro, and I mean German afro, like that, right? Really, how did you get that, And so, nonetheless, he took, I'm like a child. You don't know. Given my ethnicity and the class that I come from, there's some mystery, not unlike Boyce, to how one finds oneself able to move. And unlike the sort of battleground that Cal Arts was, Rinke was not that. Rinke was gentle, and he was kind, and he was generous. He would tell stories about Boyce, and he would read philosophy out loud in the studio, very German, like reading Schopenhauer to me, Daniel, you must, And so it's like, wow, really? And maybe it's taken 40 years. It's 40 years since 1980, more or less, right? And maybe it takes 40 years to realize what has happened to you when you were younger. Maybe it's impossible sometimes at the speed of kind of what Virilio speaks about, the speed of transmission, right? Maybe the velocity is so intense that in the way that we move in the world, particularly the way that we move in the United States, it's not possible to think about this in another way. Maybe it takes time. Maybe it takes decades. Maybe we have to figure out how to slow time down so that it almost freezes in front of you. Something moving so fast it just glides by. Nonetheless, so my perspective is, what I'm going to try to offer you tonight is, it's a combination of a number of things. It is what I think are first-hand, second-hand information that I derived from Rinka, the impact that has had on my entire life. It took time for me to realize that in my own way that the ideas of Boyce sort of found their way into my own psyche, and that not overtly, but perhaps in a much more subtle way, that these ideas started to integrate themselves into a way of being. How does one be, and how do you exist in the world? How do you embody a certain ethic and a certain philosophy, right? A certain principled life? Can you live a principled life in the world that we live in now? I don't know, it's a little difficult, it's a difficult question. But given that and consuming, I have, for just the sake of information for you, that I have read almost everything that has ever been written on Boyce. I'm not going to be here tonight to claim any kind of authorship over anything at all. I'm not here to disagree with anyone in particular. There's a number of different views on Boyce. There's a number of different interpretations of it. I'm going to offer you something unique, I believe, in the sense that I think Boyce has been misread because I think Boyce has not been understood experientially, and it's not possible for us to understand Boyce experientially because we have not been there. I think that the objects, the images I'm going to show you a kind of intimate view of Boyce through images that I worked quite a long time to collect for you and to organize for you. They create a number of arbitrary sections for us to look at and examine. And I'm hoping at the end of sort of this relationship that you will have to these images and looking at him in a number of different views, that you would hopefully form a new view of who Boyce was. The images we're going to look at are very specific in the sense that I have eliminated all of the objects. I would say by the interpretation of Boyce and my reading of Boyce, by his own account, which I will show you a quote later, the objects were meaningless. So the multiples are just like kind of fluxus garbage. They don't mean anything. They're not worth looking at. There's nothing to pay attention to on the interiority of these objects. Most of the sculptural objects that he made are also fairly uninteresting. So what I have focused on is what Boyce had focused on: education, performance, conversation, interaction, and the possibility of a consequence. Boyce asked for a consequence of his action. Consequence is something that we need to focus on because we have left behind the notion of causality. That we no longer expect our art objects or our artists to have a consequence in what they do. And if we expect no consequence from it, then really we're producing wallpaper. And very expensive wallpaper at this point in time. And so, it's again something to consider and something to think about. But in order to give a little context, we need to start somewhere. So we can't speak about Boyce if we don't understand the time that Boyce lived in, and we can't speak about Boyce contemporarily unless we look at the time that we live in now. In other words, if we want to come away with some reading of Boyce that is unique, or somehow the reading allows us to have a more intentionality with that reading, we have to examine who we are right here, right now, and we need to do that in such a manner that we are not going to shy away from the condition in the temporality that we live in now. So we have to begin here. it's impossible to not begin here, because this is I have a studio in Paris, so I spend half of my year living in Paris now, and I've been for the past few years. Oh my God, it's just like a relief. I mean, this country is going, if you're not already insane, you're going to be insane very soon, because like the pressure in this country is almost insurmountable, and the level of, of frustration. I was looking out they have me staying at the Dia apartment, and which is in Soho, which is by the Earth Room, which is quite fantastic. And I was looking out the window, and I was thinking that it's been a year. We've experienced Trump for a year. And I was imagining, I thought, well, this was kind of a dream. I thought, well, I wish this past year was sort of just, a Eugene O'Neill year, and it was just going to go away, and just I could sustain the depression of Eugene O'Neill, but not what the reality of what Trump has been. And that's not true, right? That's actually not true. And maybe what we failed to admit to ourselves is that we live in a moral and ethical vacuum. It is catastrophic what has happened to the world that we live in right now, and we seem to be unwilling to acknowledge it. What we've done is we want to fantasize and believe that a world or a country where there is no more rule of law, where the civil society has been completely disintegrated, that somehow that this nightmare will go away, and we will be able to, like an elasticity, bounce back to something that is reminiscent of a way that we believe that we would govern ourselves and the way that we would interact as human beings. I don't believe that. I don't believe it's possible that we will recover from the conditions that we live in because we're not paying attention to the condition we live in. We should be, something extreme has to happen to counterpoint the condition. I'm not talking about war, I'm not talking about violence, I'm talking about there has to be another model for us to follow by which to figure our way out of this quagmire. And we don't have it because we are relying on convention. And they're relying on the convention of social systems and structures that we have inherited, or trying to believe the same people who give us the news that we read, that we believe to be accurate, or to believe that it has some honesty in it, what's left of the notion of honesty, are the same people who told us it was not possible for Trump to be elected. They told us that, and the same people who are making the same error now in the assessment they are making contemporarily. I was living at the American Academy in Berlin last year, and it was perfectly clear to Europe when Brexit happened that Trump was going to be elected. No one here paid attention. No one paid attention that this would unfold in the way it did. And it's... we have to look no further than our own reflection in the mirror, because we are all complicit. We have all helped this situation because it's 250 years in the making. The original sins of this country, slavery and genocide, have not been reconciled. And because that has not been reconciled, we are now, 250 years later, feeling the effect of the complete collapse of the American experiment. This project, it is very possible this project cannot move forward. It's just something to think about. So anyway, very quickly, if everything is optics, let's just see what happens. So Der Spiegel, this is before Trump gets elected. Der Spiegel again, cutting off liberty. Der Spiegel with his little pointy hat. Der Spiegel is Hitler. More, one magazine after another magazine. There's no amount of critical analysis that can be leveled at the current president that seems to make any difference at all. Then he pretends that he's on Time magazine, right? But he's not on Time magazine because he turned it down, of course, right? Or this, when is it possible that we can normalize fascism? It is impossible for us in the current state that we live to normalize fascism. In case anyone, since I see a range of ages in the room, some of us will remember better than others if you know your history. 60 million people died in World War II. 60 million people, possibly up to 80 million people if you count people that died of starvation and disease. 60 to 80 million people died fighting fascism during World War II. And how is it that we have come to now to normalize the neighbor next door, he's okay because he's a regular guy, but he's also a fascist? How is it possible that this condition is acceptable in the world that we live? It is not acceptable. And from a Boycean point of view, then all of a sudden Boyce makes perfect sense. The project of Boyce makes sense because Boyce believed that he could literally rewire the entire human species. Even though that's not possible, it is inevitably what the project, it's a humanitarian project. But let's just hold on for a second. This is the result. Or this, these little signs have gone up across the, in universities across the country. I'm not sure I remember anyone saying it wasn't okay to be white. I sure remember it said people saying it's not okay to be black. And I certainly remember people saying it's not okay to be Mexican. I surely remember a whole bunch of other things. It's not okay to be gay, and it's not okay to be a lot of things. But white, I don't think I've ever heard this. You know? Or how about this, you know? In 10 minutes, 600 people are shot. There's no consequence to this at all, just 600 people. And we've actually, this is old news because it happened so quickly, it's gone by. We've forgotten already. Or this, can you believe that Newsweek would put Manson and Trump together in the same sentence? So this is all, nothing means anything anymore because any circumstance is possible now, right? Or Trump, so against a common belief, people believe Trump is an idiot. Trump is not an idiot. The reason Trump is able to be successful is because he's quite brilliant. He knows exactly what he's doing and he knows exactly how he's doing it. And anyone that believes that he's not, it is a naive view of something that is being orchestrated in front of us that has been put into effect over the past 20 or 30 years. Trump knows how to merchandise. How else do you wiggle your way into your dogs or your hats? I mean, you know, merchandising. He has monetized the presidency. Never has happened before. How about this? Oops. Why is my, oops. Something, Max? Okay, there. Okay, there. 76 visits to the golf club, $81 million. Or this, the whole ordeal over the American flag. So if you want to, how about this as just as a kind of float a proposition out for you. If you can weaponize Twitter, and a majority of the damage that is done in this country is done via a social platform. So you can't necessarily outlaw the president from using it. But what could you do that would do something very similar? There's plenty of people in this country with plenty of money. You just walk into the Twitter office and the board, and you go, how much do you want? And you put cash on the table. You buy Twitter, and you just shut it down. You just close it down to the entire world, and that's it. It's just over with. You remove the ability for the president to use Twitter, and you would change the direction of this country, just like that. And there's all kinds of people here in New York that have money to do that. I can name 10 people in LA that can do that. Why not do it? I'd buy Twitter if I could do it, and just shut them down. It would be over. He'd have to think about another way to do this, right? I mean, can you believe what happens on Twitter? It's almost impossible. So why is my thing slow? I don't understand. I'm sorry. Anyway, so this was fantastic, right? I mean, this was when he shut him down. And then earlier today, real Donald Trump's account was inadvertently deactivated due to human error by Twitter employee. The account was down for 11 minutes, and since it's restored, we are continuing to investigate and taking steps to prevent this from happening again. Twitter government, right? Okay. Of course, if you could elect a president who is a misogynist, you can elect a senator who's a pedophile. Why not, right? Or this means something, even though it's not clear exactly how this trickles down, but it has to do with this. They are connected. The economy of this is connected, right? If you can spend $450 million on a painting that's probably not even a real Da Vinci, right? Just because you can say that it's a Da Vinci, and we have to ask ourselves, who has failed worse in this scenario? Who is it that has been charged to save the light? It is us. It is those of us who are writers in artists and philosophers. It is those of us who are critics, who are theorists, those who are poets. We have failed worse than everyone else in this country because we were the last line of defense and we have let this happen. We should be held accountable for this, and we are not held accountable at all for this. This is a field day is going on. This is just funny. Look at these were the people, these are the presidents of our country, right? Not sure what that means, but take a look. Or should we be paying attention to the advance of, while we're not looking at one thing, we should be looking at something else. AI is something that we should pay attention to. It's not a view of pro or contra, it's something you should pay attention to. This is Erica, who was the first Japanese interactive AI robot. This is the first, whoops, it's telling you, I don't know why. I'm sorry. I literally do not know why it's not the case. This is Sophie. She was just given citizenship in Saudi Arabia, and her first thing that she asked for was she wanted a child. She wanted a family. This is going to be the first space station on Mars. A question that is important to ask is why is there an abundance of superhero movies? No, why? Why is there such a rise of superhero movies that exist in the world? Why is it that we were willing to spend so much money in the box office to make these films that are essentially vacuous? They have no content whatsoever in them, but yet there is something that is deep in our psyche that is asking for these two things to exist, right? I don't have the answers, and I'm merely providing I'm asking a question for you to ask a question, right? So let's pivot back for a second. So let's start somewhere else. So this is Judith Butler. This is now bringing us into focus. Ethics requires us to risk ourselves. It requires willing to be undone in relation to others. To be undone by another is an anguish, to be sure. But it is also a chance to be addressed, to be claimed, and to be bound by what is not me. This is so important. And to be bound to what is not me. It is a chance to be moved, to be prompted to act, to address myself elsewhere, and to vacate the self-sufficient I as a kind of possession. This is precisely, this is a perfect description of Boyce. This is 100% embodied the ethic of what Boyce was looking for his entire life. Or how about this? We need to revisit Beuys. We need to think about the possibility of what is fascism after World War II. This is what Beuys asks us, and it's something that we should revisit contemporarily. The only question is about fascism, because fascism seems to be connected to totalitarianism, and totalitarianism is connected to a dictatorship. And you can't talk about contemporary fascism if you don't talk about Boyce, right? This is Derrida. This is one of the last essays that he wrote before he died. He used to teach at UC Irvine. He would come every spring quarter and teach one class. I went to every single one of these classes that I could possibly go to and study with him as much as I could. Because we're always learning, right? We're always students of everyone. And so Derrida says, "For it must be cried out at a time when some have the audacity to neo-evangelize in the name of an ideal of a liberal democracy that has finally realized itself as the ideal of human history. Never have violence, inequality, exclusion, famine, and thus economic oppression affected as many human beings in the history of the earth and of humanity. Instead of singing the advent of the ideal of a liberal democracy and of the capitalist market and the euphoria of the end of history, instead of celebrating the end of ideologies and the end of the great emancipatory discourses, let us never neglect the obvious macroscopic fact made up of innumerable singular sites of suffering. No degree of progress allows one to ignore that never before in absolute figures that so many men, women, and children have subjugated and starved or been exterminated on this earth." This is a view from Derrida, right? And Derrida says, he says, "I am at war with myself, and I realized then that I was at war with the world," which has not been particularly fruitful, but nonetheless. This is my response to the Derrida. Once we heralded the fall of the Berlin Wall as an augur of the universal triumph of liberalism. After 2016, this is post-Obama, this event looks increasingly less like the end of history than the mute herald of an impending implosion. But the spectacular attacks in Paris, Nice, New York, Washington, D.C., London, and Madrid, to name a few, the relentless quasi and extrajudicial bombings and drone attacks in Afghanistan, Iraq, Pakistan, Yemen, and Syria, or the collapse of the financial markets never quite succeeded in bringing anything down decisively. Yet within and alongside these traps of our ethical attention and our other event-forming aesthetic and argumentative artifacts, live at the precipice of the figured, in the fog of becoming, in a potential realm where something might happen if and when the conditions and support for endurance emerge. There is nothing inherently good or evil, just or unjust, in these precipice conditions, and yet they may well be more decisive in shaping the continuity of a world than the spectacles of the 21st century. How do we conceptualize, politicize, aestheticize these forms of events in the effort to social endurance? An effort of social endurance, right? So I'm going to actually skip this. This is the first interstellar object to enter our atmosphere, and we'll get to Boyce. So you need an introduction before to get to the introduction, right? It's inevitable. I'm going to move much quicker now. So we have Felt Fat in the Fall to Earth, the Making of Myth of Joseph Boyce. I just don't get it. There we go. So I'm going to show you a number of images and sections. They are all annotated for you. They have dates, they have places, galleries, what the particular events are. I have isolated down to 4 or 5 events that I believe are the sum total of his sort of efforts that have meaning. And we will look at them. Some of them are chronological, and then it sort of drifted as the images amassed. Oh my gosh. His felt suit. This is one image that I wanted to put in your mind very quickly. This is Boyce, okay, 1973. In a symbolic gesture, Joseph Boyce students ferried him across the Rhine into Dusseldorf, dugout canoe called the Blue Wonder. These are his students. What does it take for this kind of devotion of students to a teacher? What is it possible? What has transpired in the interaction of the passing of knowledge that allowed something so heroic as this to manifest itself? Now the question is whether or not this is real or not. We don't know, because Boyce is inevitably an enigma wrapped in a paradox. We will never really know what is true with Boyce and what is not true with Boyce. But the question is, we have to perhaps cut through some of the mythology in order to find a sort of point by which we can at least make an argument for something about what he did in terms of the relationship to the consequence. So if we're going to do that, we have to, oh my gosh, it just makes me crazy. Okay, so here, Joseph Boyce, born in Cruffield, the son of a merchant. Joseph Boyce, Johanna Maria Boyce, 1974. The parents moved from Gurden, I'm going to mispronounce all these German words, to Cruffield in 1910. Boyce was born there on May 12, 1921, and died in 1986. You cannot speak about Boyce unless you speak about Nazis. It's impossible. This is a single, in all the books and all the essays, there's barely a page that addresses Boyce's relationship to being a Nazi. And in the few pages that it is addressed, it's glossed over as if it's a candy-coated. He's a Nazi. It's just very simple. So if we are to actually apprehend and appreciate the depth and the breadth of what Boyce has actually accomplished, which it is significant, what he has done, we have to juxtapose that against his life, half his life he spent as a Nazi. And so we have to ask ourselves, what does that mean? So this is the origin myth. This is the very first myth about Boyce. And please, I'm going to read this for you so we understand. Interesting, when the Nazi Party staged one of the notorious book-burning incidents in Cleve on May 19, 1933, in the courtyard of his school, young Joseph Boyce saved a book called Systema Natural by Karl Linnaeus from the flames. After Adolf's government made the Hitler Youth membership, Boyce was a member from a teenager of Hitler Youth. Okay? Boyce joined thousands of German children and adolescent time to be part of the notorious group when he was 15 years of age. Joseph Boyce was even part of the controversial Nuremberg rally, okay, in 1936, as we come into the end of his teens. Joseph Boyce had been indoctrinated from his very youngest age to become a Nazi. It is impossible that he pulled out a book from the flames at a book burning. If you believe this, that's great if you want to believe that, but I mean, really? You think they're burning books, everybody else is burning books, and you're going to say that Joseph Boyce found one book? This is the book that oh my God, I'm so sorry. This is supposed to work better. This is the book that he claims that he pulled out of the fire, which is a book studying nature. right? Which Boyce was exquisitely good at. But I personally don't think it's possible. We have to think that if Boyce begins with a lie, then we have to imagine what it means. So it means that he understood very carefully what it means. If we understand that sexuality is fluid and it's a construction, in other words, I can love either men or women. If we understand that gender is fluid, that I can take on the persona of gender as I choose, regardless if I'm male or female. I can even change my gender if I choose. That means that we have to understand the performativity of the very nature of identity itself. This is easier for some than others, but in this context, it is very possible that he understood that having multiple identities were useful. In other words, having different personas to project at different times. If you think about your life for a moment, when you're at home, you have one identity. When you're at work, you have another identity. If you do other activities, you go to a bar, you eat dinner, you have another identity. In fact, if you have children, you have another identity. If you have ex-wives or lovers or partners, you have identities. In fact, all of a sudden we start realizing we ourselves live in a world where we constantly transgress and exist in multiple spaces of identity simultaneously. But what we have been taught to do is to control that identity. We've been taught to compress the identity down to the narrowest bandwidth possible, so that identity then becomes convention. And then convention becomes normative. So no longer then we have the opportunity to expand in the field of identity by which we can embrace who and what we want as we choose, but we have to act a certain way in order to fit into the world that we live. Because we are being judged, and we are being judged consistently and continually with a degree of examination that has no wiggle room any longer. So what does that mean? So Boyce is quite smart. And it means that this thing doesn't work. Okay, so as the story goes, the pivotal moment of his career happened in the 16th of March in 1944. After an intense battle in the sky, Boyce's plane crashed in the Crimea front. Allegedly, he was rescued from the crash by nomadic Tartar tribesmen who had wrapped his severely injured body in animal fat, nursing Joseph back to health. Concerning the turn of this story, the artist spoke on numerous occasions, often stating that he would not be alive had it not been for the Tartars. However, German war records show that Boyce was actually delirious when the Nazis' search commando unit found him, and that there were no Tartars to be found in the vicinity, and that at this particular time. Nonetheless, such a fascinating tale has appealed to the public and is accepted as the true origins of Joseph's artistic identity following the plane incident. Boyce was then rotated back into the army, serving bravely till the end of the war as part of the paratrooper unit, and a peace treaty was signed, returned to his parents' home in Cleve. Well, that means from his very teens to the very end of the war, he was a Nazi. So what it means then, if we embrace the idea of a performance of identity, and we understand that the severity of what it must have meant to experience the war, it would seem to me the only conclusion that one could come to is that Boyce was looking for redemption. That he spent his whole time trying to find his way out of spending such an intense activity in a war. Whether one agrees with the war or doesn't agree with the war, one is still participating in the war. So what does that mean? How does it produce the phenomena of Boyce, right? It's possible. In 1969, Boyce added the famous statement, "Teaching is my greatest work of art." And to the rest of the waste product, a demonstration. The rest of the waste product is a demonstration. If you want to express yourself, you must present something tangible. But after a while, this is only a function of a historic document. Objects aren't very important to me anymore. This is why I have rejected objects for what I'm going to show you. I want to get to the origin of the matter, to the thought behind it. Boyce saw the role of art as a teacher or a shaman who could guide society in a new direction. So if indeed he's looking for redemption, and indeed he is trying to reconfigure his entire identity, it means that he has to come up with a myth that allows him to operate within that vernacular. So, fat. I'm sorry. In 1965, Joseph Boyce rests his cheek against the fat Galleria. He says that everything changes if it's formed, you approach it with love. So if indeed it's a humanitarian project, then the idea of Boyce is also intimately involved with the dissemination of the idea of love. Love is something that we can find that is inevitable will be the conclusion. If we had more love in the world, we would probably have a very different world, right? Boyce says, everyone is an artist. That's not true, because that was misinterpreted. Okay? Boyce said, let's make politics into art. Maybe. We can think about that one a little longer. Boyce says, everyone carries within oneself an organic model of the future. That could be possible. That's like science fiction. But it is optimistic and hopeful. Boyce says, bringing people together to speak together for me is the most important work of art. Now that is perfectly true. What do we need more of is we need more conversation. We need the ability to actually talk to each other about the things that are most difficult to talk about. Boyce says, what the mouth does with speech, the words it releases, these are the real sculptures. The sculpture of speech drills itself into your ear. Thought is a sculpture. Writing is a sculpture. Creativity is our real capital. No, come on. You've got to help me here. Okay, so if Boyce says that everyone is an artist, Boyce was ideologically in a battle with Duchamp. He says, Silence of Marcel Duchamp is overrated in 1964. So this is a conversation. Boyce asks, who is qualified to create? Duchamp says, he who invents the sign. Therefore, I am the only and or the greatest or the last artist. Boyce replies, those who know the language of the world, that is to say, you and I. Boyce's entire project was an antithesis of objecting to Duchamp. Duchamp produced a conceptual, cool, detached, objective intervention into what we understood was art. Boyce wanted art to be emotional. Boyce wanted it to be social. Boyce wanted us to be responsible. So he, in fact, in suggesting that everybody could be an artist, he's actually in conversation with Duchamp. As you can read this, I'm going to read one particular point, which is just here. Novalis was really important as a philosopher to Boyce, and what is important here, so that this translated into Boyce's formulation of the concept of social culture, in which society as a whole was to be regarded as one great work of art, the Wagnerian Kunstwerk, to which each person can contribute creatively. Perhaps Boyce's most famous phrase, borrowed from Novalis, is everyone is an artist. Boyce did not even originate the term. The term was borrowed from Novalis, which is also, we forget to credit because we assume he supersedes the authorships of this language as he has superseded many things, right? Okay. Boyce said, the state of the world is a crime of humanity, and I include myself. The state of the world is a crime of humanity, and I include myself. However, I am trying to overcome the laziness weighing on my consciousness. This statement is very important to think about. If we're thinking about Boyce trying to reconcile his Nazi past, if we're thinking that Boyce is trying to attempt to change the direction, is it possible to change the entire direction of the human species? Can you unhardwire what humans are hardwired to do? I don't think it's possible, but I think that it's so hopeful, and it's a euphoria, what Boyce proposed. And it's something that we should aspire to as a project, but maybe we have forgotten how to do that. Okay. So this is what I've been suggesting. The project Boyce was to counter fascism. So we're going to look at portrait of Joseph Boyce. 1941, this is Boyce here, even though it doesn't look like Boyce. This is 1942, Boyce in World War II in his little Lufthansa outfit. Joseph Boyce in his training for the bomber. Look at him. Look at that Boyce, right? It's fantastic. This is Boyce with his crashed plane. This is Boyce and his wife. Now, there's something fascinating that you need to think about. Boyce had a family. And we have to then think about, well, how does the family of Boyce play into Boyce? Because they were there. His wife and children existed. But Boyce seems singular in his representation, the way he existed in the world. But yet he was not. He was not alone in the world. He had his children, right? This is Boyce, an early portrait of Boyce. Oh man, technology is really killing me today. 1961, I love his hair. Boyce's hair was always something. Okay, Boyce with an early sculpture. I'm going to give up in a second. Boyce and Ava. 68, Boyce and his son, Wenzel. Oh my gosh, something makes me, okay. No. Boyce in 68 with his sculpture. Boyce in Hamburg. Boyce with his son walking down the street. Very few pictures actually show Boyce laughing or smiling, and this is one of them. I have one other fantastic one I'll show you. Boyce in Minneapolis. Boyce being serious. Boyce with his children. Boyce with Hans Hollein. Portrait of Boyce. With wife again. Eat Art Gallery, 1971. Boyce in Stockholm, 1971. Boyce understood photography, and Boyce understood he's singularly one of the most photographed artists that has ever existed. And I'm at the point I want you to hold on to, because if that's true, that means that somebody was always following him with a camera. That means that he understood to have himself constantly documented as an individual. And so what does it mean when you recognize that every action you take can be translated into a work of art then? That means that the mere embodiment of oneself becomes a work of art if one then signs that work of art, or one attaches a meaning to that work of art, as you will see very closely. This one, for example, this is the very famous one. It's called The Revolution. This is just Boyce walking down the street. This is just the recognition of you can walk, it's just a picture of him walking down the street. This is singularly one of the most famous photographs of Boyce. And how are we able to subscribe meaning to this? Because Boyce is able to do that. And how is he able to do that? That's a rhetorical question, but this is what I'm hoping that we get at here. Boyce again in 1972, right? Starting to identify whom is taking pictures of Boyce. This is Joseph Beuys with the president of the Minneapolis College, and this is an Austrian exhibit. I think it's going to work. Let's see. This is Boyce in Edinburgh, Boyce in Ireland, Boyce in Ireland again. He just stands places. Everywhere he stands, a photo is taken. Everywhere the photo is taken, he's at a place. Everywhere he's at a place, he does an action, and all of a sudden that means something. Boyce standing out in the causeway. Boyce investigating plant life, okay? Boyce in Ireland with his hands up. Boyce in Sandy Cove, right, where James Joyce lived before leaving Ireland for Europe. So you stand where James Joyce lived. He follows history. Pay attention to this. Boyce understood to trace the history that pre-existed him. By tracing the history that pre-existed him, he then revisits that history, and then he includes it. He inserts himself in the inheritance of that history by becoming. He is becoming James Joyce here. By becoming James Joyce, he amplifies his position of being Boyce, because we don't know what Boyce is yet, but he transmutates the essence of James Joyce by his existence on this site. This is something very, very, very clever, very smart to do, and Boyce did this his entire life. 1974, the artist into society, society into art. So there are some people here I want you to look at. So 1, 2, 3. This man here is Gerhard Steidl, whom I know. Gerhard Steidl, for those of you that understand publishing, Steidl is a German press. Steidl is one of the only printers in the world that does decanter printing. What that means is that when the plates hit the press, that they move. A decanter printing, the plates move, and so what happens is it erases the dot when the print is pressed, when the plates go over each other. There's no more dot in it, okay? This is probably some of the most beautiful printing in the world. Steidl knew Boyce his whole life. I went to his printing press one time. Steidl would open drawers and there would be Boyces. They're just laying around because they knew each other their whole life. And then, I think, is she here? She's not in this photo. I want you to show you Caroline Tisdale, because she was also implemental. Where is she? Should be here, right? Yeah, because that's the Bob. Anyway, we'll get more to her. This is not going, sorry. It's not doing it. Okay, very frustrating. really killing me. There's Caroline there, and Steidl again. That's good, right? That one's really good. Boyce is the lion, right? Of course he is. Okay, this is Richard DeMarco. Richard DeMarco was single-handedly introduced Boyce to an English-speaking audience. He single-handedly brought Boyce to an American world, right? Boyce with his canes for a cover of a magazine, of course. This is Boyce with Blinky Palermo. If I'm not mistaken, I think Dia is the steward of Blinky Palermo's work for the people of New York, right? Which is, if you have not seen this work, there's a fantastic set of works of Blinky Palermo, who was a friend of Boyce the whole time, so was Gerhard Richter. These were people that were in conversation at this time. This one again, I'm so sorry. I don't know why it's not working. This is Boyce walking down the street in amongst the trees, okay? This is Boyce collecting soil in the trees, right? It's really an extraordinary feat by which to translate every action that has, to have that action have meaning. Portrait of Boyce. I don't know who Archus Klutz is, but it doesn't really matter because he's holding up the book, so it obviously has some sort of historic meaning. Boyce in his studio, Boyce cooking. This was something that I was told stories by which Rinke also did. The act of cooking, which has then been copied by innumerous amounts of artists over time, and we could make a list of them actually, but Boyce apparently cooked all the time, and he cooked for his students. He basically cooked for anyone who would show up at his house. Rinke did the exact same thing. Rinke cooked every day. Rinke invited you to his house. He invited you in the morning. He invited you for breakfast. He invited you for lunch. He would cook. He would make eggs. He would make you coffee. He would make, if you wanted, you want to eat. Are you hungry? Or you want to go sit by the tree? I mean, this idea of social interaction is actually not something that is, it's not fake. It's actually genuine. Constant. What is the most lovely thing you can do but feed people? You feed family, you feed friends. What is more intimate in a sense than this kind of interaction? So this is something very important. Boyce with a hair, of course. The back of Boyce's head. Boyce with more than one hair. Boyce also did something unique, which is he signed everything. Every single thing that he was attached to, he signed, therefore, again, signing a different kind of a significance of the object itself. These are, oh, yeah, okay, here we go. Now, this is a set of photographs by Charles Wipp, who was a German photographer and a German filmmaker. And this is, the period of time that we have to think about for a moment is at the end of the war, between the end of the war and 1960. 1960 was when Boyce becomes a professor at the Kunstakademie. Between the end of the war, but we're talking about approximately 15-year period of time. If you look at the objects that Boyce made during this period, there's nothing. You couldn't get that portfolio into an undergraduate school, okay? Because he was clueless. If you look at them, there is no basis to imagine how the Boyce in 1960 emerged out of these 15 years. So something important, something significant, there was some kind of transformation that took place for Boyce, and we don't know what that is. There is nothing, I've looked, and I have researched this because I wanted to know what happened to Boyce in these 15 years. It's very, very mysterious because there is not much that indicates what happened to him, but there's a few photographs of forays like this. So this is called these nature trips that they did in Africa, which is Boyce doing sand drawings in his bikini, little underwear there, right? And here he is. This is the Boyce you will never see very often. Boyce bald, Boyce on the beach making these drawings with Charles Wipp. These are fantastic. Look at these pictures. These are fantastic images of Boyce. Sand drawings, right? You will never see Boyce so, what would be the word? Exposed. This also, if you look at this and you realize that if you think about Rinka was making works that dealt with the same way Boyce connected the energy of the world through honey, and he did it through the environment and looking at the bog actions and looking at plants. Boyce did it through the waterways on the earth. So he looked at the rivers and he looked at the oceans, and this is the indication, again, of Boyce's influence on Rinka. And Rinka became his own artist and a significant one, but you can see how Boyce was so effective as a teacher. Boyce and Whip again, they were apparently very good friends. Look at the look on his face. You know, I mean, they're something. 1970, Kunst's capital, we'll get into that more. Boyce and Warhol were very good friends. So these are, I'm going to show you a whole bunch. I mean, it's consistent. Look at this. Again, Boyce laughing. And very rarely see him having so much fun, right? Boyce and Warhol. In Naples. Conference. Warhol having his hand eat while holding hands with Boyce. Boyce and Warhol again. Boyce and Warhol again. Boyce and Warhol in Rauschenberg. There we go. And there's the picture. It's fantastic, right? Boyce and Warhol. Boyce and Warhol. I mean, so you cannot underestimate, I mean, the relationship here. If Boyce is in conversation with Warhol during this period of time, the influence is moving both directions. And if there are three people that we have to address during this period, there are three individuals that changed the entire course of art in the 20th century. One would be Duchamp, which is obvious. The other was Boyce, and the other was Warhol. So we have to think of them as a trilogy. We have to think of the influence and counter-influences of these three artists simultaneously existing in time passing between them. Let's see, it's curious to me. This is Boyce and Buckminster Fuller, which makes perfect sense. Boyce portrait. This is a second trip to Africa with Whip. This is not the same trip as I just showed you. Even though it looks very similar, it is not the same trip. There's something about these images that are pretty fascinating to me. Because this is pre-war, this is a pre-Boyce Boyce. This is pre-1960. Oh, this is 1980, I'm sorry. That's not correct. Boyce in his studio. For Blinky, that. Of all the events in Boyce's life, this is one that has gone unremarked for some reason. But Boyce was focused very specifically on the Dalai Lama. He wanted to connect with the Dalai Lama, not only document it and make a special event, but he wanted to have conversations with the Dalai Lama. And for those of you who have not read about Boyce or are looking for books on Boyce, there's probably two. The Energy Plan for the Western Man, which was done in 1993, is one that should be read. Another book is this book. This is Boyce meeting the Dalai Lama in 1982 in Bonn. This is Boyce and the Dalai Lama. This is Boyce wanting, HH meaning His High Holiness, wanted to meet him in Kassel. This is Boyce. This is Boyce meeting the Lama Rinpoche in Paris. I'm going to briefly go over this. Lorraine Withers is a Dutch artist and writer living in Amsterdam in Santa Ana Paulina. She was involved in the Fluxus art movement and worked with Joseph Beuys from 1968 through 1968 through 1986. Like Boyce, she considered writing and speaking as sculpture. In the beginning, 1978, Withers conducted a series of interviews where three charismatic men from the continents Europe, America, and Asia was the first Joseph Beuys who passed the same questions onward to Andy Warhol, who in turn suggested that the Dalai Lama be asked next in line to answer the same questions. Their conversation focused on the future of art, religion, and money. I interviewed Lorraine on the 9th of 11th of Skype, and her memories and thoughts of the interviews in the series of a great collaboration of interdisciplinary work, Matthew Stone, who made the film. My deepest wish was to interview Boyce, so it started doing that in 1978. Boyce asked her to pass on the questions, so the questions that Boyce and Lorraine asked each other, she then asked the same questions of Warhol, and then in turn asked the exact same questions of the Dalai Lama. Here is the book, Writing as Sculpture. This is probably some of the most insightful and beautiful essays written on Boyce. This is the exact event. The first conversation with Boyce, the second conversation with Warhol, and the third conversation with the Dalai Lama. This is Warhol. This is Withers. Boyce and assistant. Boyce and assistant. Boyce and assistant. Boyce and Namjoon Paik, also someone that he collaborated with. Boyce and Namjoon Paik in Japan. 1984, in the Tokyo Museum. This is a portrait of Boyce before he came to America. This is the beginning of 1972. Now in 1974, the Feldman Gallery. Social sculpture at the Feldman Gallery in 74. On his way to America, he covered his face the entire plane ride over from Germany into America. Boyce visits New York. There are three major events in New York that embody Boyce. When Boyce visited New York in the 1970s, with the stinging relevance today, he renamed the World Trade Center Twin Towers after the Greek healing saints Cosmas and Darian. This is the renaming of the World Trade Center. I like America and America likes me. This is 1974, New York. Boyce came to New York and spent 3 days living with the Coyote in the Rene Block Gallery. This performance is that title there. So if you look at all the documentation of this is probably one of the most significant events of Boyce. What is fantastic about what I'll show you the pictures, not only these are lovely images of Boyce, but this is a bit of a misnomer because Boyce actually did not live with the Coyote. Boyce went in and out of the Coyote every day. So the idea that the perception is that he lived with the Coyote, again, is another adding to the myth of Boyce. Everything, you can't take Boyce at face value. You have to look behind what Boyce represents because Boyce he's never giving you the truth. So you have to then read into what he represents himself as. So that's something useful because that means in the world where there's no truth, how do we understand anything? But if you go back into art history, we realize that fiction has been a tool of artists and writers since the beginning of time. Fiction is the tool we have. We invent ourselves and reinvent ourselves and reinvent ourselves again. Why wouldn't we avail ourselves to this? Right? So why wouldn't Boyce? Why is he criticized for doing this? There seems no reason. So from being in the airplane, he goes immediately into the back of an ambulance. Driving down the freeway, these are fantastic. So period. This is inside of he's wrapped in felt. Coming to the gallery. He's taken out of the gallery, put onto a gurney. He's wheeled into the gallery. I do not understand why my computer's under. This is him with the Coyote. This is probably the most iconic image of him with the Coyote. So for Boyce, the image of the Coyote was something that represented, it was a mythical creature. The mythical creature, he was capitalizing on a Native American sort of interpretation of how animal spirits can be embodied and transferred into another person. The spirit of the Coyote is something that he absorbed himself to become the Coyote. And so the Coyote becomes Boyce and he becomes a Coyote. So they become each other simultaneously. These are all pictures taken by Caroline. This is 50 copies of the Wall Street Journal were added to the closed space in which every day the coyote urinated on them. And Boyce was very specific about them being the Wall Street Journal, hence his view of finance. This is him exiting. This is him being put back into the ambulance when the performance was done after 3 days. And that's him going away. This is the poster for the performance. This is, I always wondered why Boyce never made it to Los Angeles, probably because we have larger coyotes in the West than you do out here. So this is the second, what I would say, if the coyote piece is instrumental in us understanding Boyce performatively, then this is the second event that is probably the most instrumental in understanding a way to embody an ethos. Boyce comes to the United States and he's here for 1 month. He visits 3 cities, he visits 3 different schools. And during that time, he is in constant conversation and he's in constant mode of teaching and in interacting with students. This is the book, if you're interested in this book. This would be the other one to get. Boyce's chalkboard drawings are then, at this point, become instrumental in understanding who Boyce is. These are the drawings that have significance, and these are the drawings, these are diagrams, these are schematics of a way of thinking about the world that we live in. What is curious to me is that he was in New York, he was in Chicago, and he was in Minneapolis. It's very odd. This is Boyce at his best in a sense because this is Boyce as a teacher. And this is Boyce as a disseminator of information and ideas. If Boyce's life in Europe is the most documented, he's the most documented, and everywhere he goes, everything he does, he's photographed. When he comes to America, during this month-long performance that he does, there are no photographs. It's very peculiar. There are no photographs of, I looked and I looked and I looked. There are no photographs of him at these 3 schools, which leads me to believe, because in the few pictures that I have, there are hardly any students with him when he was teaching. And I think this has to do with the complete misinterpretation of Boyce in the United States. I think Boyce was always uncomfortable with coming to the United States. I think he came to the United States because I thought he believed that he could heal this country, or that he could attempt to engage in a discourse where he had the possibility of healing this country, even though he might not have understood the nature of the sickness that had inflicted us. But there is something peculiar, because why wouldn't he be photographed here? These are probably the most important blackboard drawings that he did were done in the United States during these 3 events. Why did these go unremarked? Why did these go undocumented? Why did no one ever pay attention? So my sort of thought on this would be that the claim is that Joseph Boyce was one of the most influential artists in the 20th century. I actually don't believe that. I think Joseph Boyce was probably a very influential artist in Europe, but Boyce was never an influential artist in the United States. And I think that he was resisted because we had already adopted a very much a Duchampian, Warholian view. We had gone through a number of different movements already, abstract expressionism, minimalism. We're set on a different trajectory where capitalism and art had become intertwined with each other. And Boyce is the opposite of that. The reason Boyce was able to be successful and wealthy at some point was because he had multiples. He understood marketing the same way Trump understands marketing. He marketed himself by which to get the resources by which to be able to engage in the lifestyle that he had. That lifestyle was not to make objects to sell. He had the most uncommodifiable life that you've ever seen of an artist. That's why there was never been an artist before Boyce. Like him, there will never be an artist after Boyce, because this was unique to the time, and it was unique to the opportunity to try to heal himself as he was trying to heal the world around him. But it says something that this country was not open to these ideas, perhaps due to the criticism, perhaps due to the interpretation of Boyce, perhaps people objected to his Nazi past, people objected to the mythology, perhaps people objected to the fiction, but there was an objection here where Boyce never was accepted. I can safely say, this is my experience, I've never had a student in 30 years ask me about Boyce. I don't know, I've taught in most schools in the United States, from New York, all four directions. I've never heard of another person teaching Boyce in a university or an art school. He doesn't exist. He's never mentioned. He doesn't come up. Because it's a non-commodified, a non-object possibility. Of course, there are places and people that would do it. I have been doing it. But it's not a mainstream of thinking for people because I think we object to it. There is something about Boyce we object to very deeply. And it is something that we need to think about. I can't identify exactly what it is, but I think it's there. The next work is Honey Pump. This is a significant work. Honey Pump served as a core for the Free International University. Boyce explains, with Honey Pump, I'm expressing the principle of a free international university, working with the bloodstream of society, flowing in and out of the heart organ, the steel honey container, or the main arteries through which the honey is pumped out of the engine room with a pulsing sound, circulates round the Free International University area and returns to the heart. The whole thing is only complete with people in the space around which the honey arteries flow. It's a circulatory system. He has created a circulatory system as a metaphor for who we are as a society. 1977, honey flowing in all directions. It's of note that Boyce says that it only functions when people interact with the sculpture. You need people for the sculpture to be complete. It's not often that you hear an artist say that. Let's move to teaching now a little bit. His idea of the Free University. So in 1961, Boyce is appointed professor of monumental sculpture, the Kunstakademie. Boyce in a meeting with the German Student Party, formation of the Student Party. Boyce in 1972 is dismissed from his teaching post in Düsseldorf. They go on a hunger strike. The students go on a hunger strike. Boyce signs copies of Intuition as he's been dismissed as the professor there. This is him being taken out of the school. This is him literally being thrown out of the school. And why did this happen? Is because Boyce believed that everyone applied to the school should be let into the school. He didn't believe anyone should be rejected from having an opportunity to have an education. Can you imagine doing that in the United States? Can you imagine that you just let everyone in, just open the doors and let everyone have an education? We can't even figure out how to educate our country, much less offer education for free, which is an interesting idea. This is a 12-hour lecture. This is very Asher-esque. We used to have 12-hour critiques. They were the longest critiques ever existed in the world. 12-hour lecture, again doing drawings on blackboards. This is in more images of him crossing the Rhine in his canoe. Belgrade, drawings, teaching. These are all from Belgrade. Oh, this is, do you notice who that was? Marina Abramovich. I wonder if she learned anything. 100 Days of Free University, 100 Days of the Free University in Kassel. In Europe, the devotion of the students is consistent because we have documentation. We can see everywhere he went, every place he went, he was surrounded by students. Talking, drawing, interacting. Talking, drawing, interacting. Talking, drawing, interacting. Talking, drawing, interacting. This is what Boyce did best. Nothing else compares to this activity. Everything else that Boyce did is pales in comparison to this devotion, singular devotion to others and teaching and passing information and knowledge. Constantly diagramming his ideas. Lecturing, drawing. I show you all these because it's useful. Healing Germany through art. Healing Germany through art. So that it would suggest then that my assertion is true, that Boyce inevitably had to reconcile his past. He had to heal himself before he could heal others. He had to heal the country of Germany for what happened during the war. He had to come to terms with it. Even though in interviews he says it's not true, I don't believe him. I don't believe he could have experienced the trauma of World War II and come out on the other side and not have been completely psychologically damaged. And I think this, which is the title of this, I think it is exactly true. Boyce lecturing for university. Boyce, again, every single place he goes, every single time he is in a city, every school he is out, he is surrounded by people like this. I ask this as a kind of rhetorical question, but what does it take to do this? What kind of phenomena, what is the kind of persona does one have where one is able to attract people at this level, to this degree? It is not common in my experience. It's not something that I've seen replicated. We'll get to, these are drawings he did for Jimmy Boyle, and we'll get to Jimmy Boyle as an explanation later. His attraction to Jimmy Boyle is a curious one. Boyce at the Guggenheim. It's a curious question. So if Boyce did energy plan for Western man by traveling to 3 cities in the United States where he's teaching, if he does the coyote work in the United States where he lives with the coyote, it seemed then that the event of him doing the exhibition at the Guggenheim is an exercise of objects. And it seems the opposite of what Boyce has devoted his entire life to. Was not able to see this exhibition, but I have the catalog for the exhibition. And it seems like a normal exhibition of objects that Boyce made, which seems curious to me because it wasn't the focus of his life. So once again, it seems that the reception of Boyce and the way that Boyce was processed could only be processed through the objects he made in the United States and not through his performances and not through his teaching. It seems the teaching and the performances are rejected, but the objects are accepted, hence an exhibition at the Guggenheim. Because he did not perform at the Guggenheim. He did not teach at the Guggenheim. He displayed objects in a very, very normative manner, which is not a negative interpretation of that. It's just simply what that is. Direct democracy. Boyce believed that there was a possibility of a new party. He believed that binary politics was a failed way to look at politics in the world. So in Documenta 5, he sets up a political bureau where he spent 100 days sitting down with 100 roses every day, making a drawing on a blackboard every day for 10 hours a day, speaking to anyone who wanted to come in and sit down with him and talk about any subject that he was willing to want to talk about. The rally for the Green Party. This is the beginning of his movement in the Green Party. This is, again, now we get to one of his earliest performances, which again is curious. So if he starts teaching in 60-61, in his studio in 1962, he had a dead tree with the pine needles on the ground of his studio. 1963, the first Fluxus event happens in Dusseldorf, where all of the major Fluxus performers were there, which he participated in. 1965, he does one of the most significant works he's ever done. I'm going to read this to you. Boyce sat on a chair in one corner of the gallery next to the entrance. He had poured honey over his head, to which he then affixed $50 worth of gold leaf. In his arms, he cradled a dead hare, to which he looked steadfastly. Then he stood up. He walked around the room, holding the dead hare in his arms. He held it up close to the pictures on the wall. He seemed to be talking to it. By putting the honey on my head, I am clearly doing something involved with thinking. Boyce said, the image of the man made mute by his thinking, his over-rationalization is deeply unsettling. Perhaps this serves to emphasize Boyce's opinion that Western society is too rational. Hence, his response to Duchamp. Duchamp was too rational for him. Boyce wanted an irrationality in the world that we live in. In other words, he wanted a kind of chaos to exist. Boyce claimed that he preferred explaining pictures to a dead hare than to other people, which is a contradiction because he has spent his entire life talking to other people. So what does he mean by this, right? He said, a hare comprehends more than many human beings with their stubborn rationalism. I told him that they needed to only scan the picture to understand what is really important about it. So this is no, it's not. I'm seeing, there it is. This is the classic, the most beautiful of the images of Boyce because it is the most solemn. He did this performance. This was not he doesn't say anything. This performance is done in silence. And he literally takes the hare and whispers to it as he shows it pictures. And then he sits down. But it is the antithesis of absolute silence in the room. There's nothing else. There's other people in the room, but it is quiet. It is so quiet. This is the hare with a bandaged felt leg. This is Boyce smoking, which I've never seen before, him smoking after performance, which is something, right? I'm sorry. So this is the audience with him in the gallery. I put this one in because Boyce and fat is important as a healing substance. Also, this particular work, 8 corners, 8 wedges of fat, is probably one of the very sort of beautiful sort of installations using to heal the room, to heal the space. Three pots for the poorhouse. This is all done in Edinburgh. If you look at the kinds of spaces that Boyce, other than the Guggenheim, all the spaces that Boyce performs in, almost all the spaces he puts works in, all the places where he interacts in, are non-commercial spaces. They're non-institutional spaces. In fact, he's in the bottom of a basement here. He's usually in a classroom. So in other words, the formalization of Boyce did not happen during his lifetime in the way that we understand exhibition contemporarily. Something else happened with Boyce. Boyce was constantly steering clear of the kind of normative manner in which we see exhibition now. I'm not sure it's possible to do this today. I'm not sure that you could find the kind of spaces by which to sort of express ideas, but it was possible during this time. Boyce was Namjoon Paik. René Bloch, there's a handful of individuals in Boyce's life that were seminal to Boyce. I mean, they provided him with space, they provided him with time, they provided him with criticality, they provided him with documentation, they provided him with money. He had help. Boyce did not do this on his own. This is Boyce, the band called BAP, and they sung a song about Reagan. Okay, I wish I was not able to find the song for you, but this is Boyce in a rock band. Okay? Son instead of Reagan. Oops. There, singing, Joseph Boyce singing with Namjoon Paik, with Namjoon Paik, with Namjoon Paik. Here at the Tate, the Venice Biennial. Directional forces is important. This is an installation of 100 chalkboards, which was done over about a 20-year period, a collection of about 20 years of drawings on chalkboards, all from lectures. Boyce developed the role of the artist as a pedagogue throughout the 1970s, including discussion and teaching in his expanded definition of art, delivering lectures in galleries, art colleges using complex annotated chalkboards on blackboards. His thinking was highly influenced by the work of other educationalist thinkers. Rudolf Steiner and the theories of social sculpture and social organism as a work of art emerged from Steiner's theories. So again, he's borrowing, a lot of Boyce's ideas he's borrowing from Steiner. These are the the blackboards. Are we okay in time? Okay. This is him with Jimmy Boyle. I want to get to part with Jimmy Boyle for you. This is 7,000. This is another work that is significant, and this is also a work that's under the stewardship of Dia. But perhaps the origin of this work at Documenta is the one to see about this. And this is the 7,000 Oaks. This is a spectacular effort on Boyce's behalf. These are the pieces of basalt that would then accompany each tree that was planted. And his interest in nature and his interest in plant life, his interest in ecology, his interest in a kind of circulatory system, what we can learn from plants, what we can learn from animals, that there was a way that these things would constantly cycle back. You would take from them and then you would replenish them, and you would take from them and they replenish. In other words, they would be constantly feeding themselves. So the idea of planting oaks, 7,000 oaks, is something that was looking not to happen now, but something that would look in the future. Boyce was never singularly looking at the time he was in. He was looking and projecting himself into a future because he believed that we could save ourselves. He was hopeful that there was another way to exist in the world. It might be wishful thinking, but it's the right way to think. This is the planting of the trees. Can you imagine? Oh, there, it's not there yet. It's on my screen. There it is. This is the original planting of the oaks, which is just a phenomenon. I mean, how can you get further away from the institutional, commodified notion of art that we experience today? And it's not a suggestion that, I'm not suggesting that the commodification of art is inherently bad. What I'm suggesting that it has just gotten to such an extreme point, we have lost sight of everything else that we believed in it, that we embodied in art. And this is the exact opposite of that. This is an energy that is directed towards something else. So this is good. So this is Richard DeMarco, was the first dealer who brought Boyce to the English-speaking world. Introduced Boyce to Jimmy Boyle, who had become an artist while serving a life sentence in Barlini prison for murder. Boyle introduced himself by saying, "Hello, Joseph, I am the Coyote." James Jimmy Boyle was born May 17, 1944, as a Scottish gangster and convicted murderer who became a sculptor and novelist after his release from prison. In 1967, he was sentenced to life imprisonment for the murder of another gangster figure, William Babs Rooney, but released 14 years later. Boyce was instrumental in getting Boyle released, but what is the attraction to a murderer, and why did Boyce assign so much energy and time to this one individual? Again, it's not a question that I can find an answer to, but I would imagine that he saw something in Jimmy Boyle, and he saw something about the crime that was committed, and he tried to save him. For some reason, Boyce saw the necessity to save this man in prison. Maybe this answer was enough. Maybe this was intriguing enough by which to seduce Boyce and by which to do that. It's hard. You don't know. This is all about Jimmy Boyle. Boyce created a hunger strike for Jimmy Boyle. This is Boyce with the Green Party. This is a conference in The Hague. This is an early action of Joyce when he was hit in the face. 24-hour action, the Celtic action, bog action. Sweeping action. Bureau for Organized Direct Democracy, protest, Boyce gets into a boxing ring for direct democracy. Licking fat, sleeping on fat, making music, a conference on beyond capitalism and communism. This is Petra Kelly, who was the leader of the Green Party. This is Boyce with Petra Kelly. This is a piece that Boyce did on Baader Meinhof. This is a color photograph of Documenta. This is Boyce right before he died. And this is the end of Boyce. Boyce was a sculptor, a teacher, performance artist, a maverick politician, and one of the most influential and controversial men of his generation in Europe. Died of a heart failure Thursday at his home in Düsseldorf. He was 64 years old. So what is Boyce? Boyce was a performance artist, and Boyce was a teacher, and Boyce believed in direct democracy. Boyce believed in free education. Boyce cleaned the streets, and Boyce played music, and Boyce inevitably had so many personas, and he had so many ways of identifying himself. Boyce, there is not a Boyce. There's a multiplicity of Boyces. This multiplicity of Boyces what I try to do for you tonight is to show you. I drowned you in images, in a sense, by which to somehow to try to understand the totality of one person's existence, one person's contribution. What does it mean to dedicate an entire life to someone else? I think that Boyce's life was dedicated to other people. I think that Boyce was selfish, like all artists are selfish, but I believe that Boyce's ambition was to genuinely ask ourselves, can we be better than we have been? Can we better ourselves? Can we become something else? Are we only a victim to our own DNA? Are we only a victim to our own animal nature? Is the only thing that we know, is the only conflict resolution we have is conclude with violence? And is the only thing that we know that is a way to exploit other people and other things in order to make more money? Is everything in the world always about taking? Is there ever a moment that exists when we give? I think that's a singular question that Boyce asked. Can you give back into a world? Can you be responsible to give back into a world and not ask something of it? I mean, if indeed Boyce's first half of his life is his indoctrination of him being a Nazi, perhaps one of the worst things that we have imagined in the 20th century, that it means that then his second half of his life was completely devoted to the opposite of that. Everything in his being was directed towards this project. This project was a project of redemption. This project was to save himself, but in saving himself, he believed he could save others. That's an ambition that it seems worthwhile to me. Maybe it's an ambition that we have forgotten. Maybe we don't know how to treat each other anymore. Maybe we don't know the right questions to ask. Maybe we don't know the right responses, if there is even a right response. But what is our response to this kind of effort? And why is it that this effort has not been able to replicate itself? What have we become that we cannot become this? Why do we no longer think about ourselves as a species on a planet? Why are we so tribal in our nature? Why are we so hateful of everything that we do not recognize or understand? Why are we judgmental of everyone and everything around us that does not look like us, does not sound like us, does not behave like us? Why do we do that? It's a rhetorical question. It's not a question I can answer for any of us. It's one that perhaps that we need to ask ourselves. But I think that was Boyce's life's devotion, was to ask that question. It's unique to the time. Boyce was unique to the time, to the mid to late 20th century. It's an analog world. It's a world of letters, and it's a world of film, and it's a world of speech. It's a world of intimacy. It's a world that required call and response. It's a world of ethics, because we had to find ourselves a way to get out of a post-war condition. What does that mean for us? What does it mean for the direction of who we are as a species contemporarily? I think all these are things that Boyce asked, and This is an incomplete, what I offered you today is an incomplete view of Boyce, but it is my view of Boyce. It's the part of Boyce that I think about, and it's the part of Boyce that have questions about in terms of how this is applicable in my own life. Because if it's applicable to us individually, then it's applicable to the people that we love around us. Because we have to aspire contemporarily to something other than the condition that we live. Because in the trajectory that we're on, this species is going to cease to exist. That's not difficult to figure out. Look at what is happening around us. Look what is happening in the world. Is this the world that you really want to live in? People behaving the way they do like this? This is an opportunity, not as a model, but it is an opportunity to be inspired. Individually, in our own way, in our own world. Boyce is an inspiration at this level. And I think we should pay attention. Because I think Boyce made a difference in the world. There was a consequence to his life. And that consequence he passed to us as a gift. Right? Potlatch. He gave us a gift. And that gift is to be passed on again, if we know how to do that. But with that, thank you very much. That's Boyce.
Thank you, Daniel. Nice. Thank you. Thank you. Lots of questions, but if anyone has something pressing they might want to ask Daniel, something that came up, maybe we'll take one or two, or maybe I'll just leave you with Daniel's questions. If there's any.
No, yes, but you understand my point though, right?
I do, and other lectures of yours that focused on tech versus, that fleshed out even more context for what he operated within and where we are now. But two things that came up for me in this lecture that made me think about Europe versus US. I think the mode of the shaman, the savior, the idea of redemption, and just the extensiveness and belief in education and the arena of education that we had in Europe are two things that I don't, if they existed here or do exist here, they exist most, I think, in California. To some, less than, certainly more than East Coast. But just, it's hard to gauge his impact on a larger population in Europe. I feel like he had a huge impact on students, his students, and other artists. But for me, the issue has always been the ego in the midst of all of that.
Sure.
In terms of what to take from him and how to take from him.
Sure. I mean, let me answer. So I think, like you and me, and I could name a dozen other people who teach, and yes, we are focal points or lightning rods for discussions around Boyce. So my statement was that what I meant was it doesn't exist out of a number of us who continue the Boycean legacy and believe that there is something to extrapolate out of what Boyce was and to decode that in a sense and find ways that that's contemporarily applicable. So it's not to say that it doesn't have an influence, but I would say that I think it's different than Duchamp. You can't, there's not an art school, there's not a university, there's not a person. I can go on the street right now and ask somebody about Duchamp. They're going to say, yeah, of course. They know something. They recognize the name. Boyce never was able to accomplish that here. And maybe it is part and parcel to what you're suggesting, that there is the environment for education and the environment for the kind of the dissemination of ideas that Boyce had as a platform in Europe at that time was uniquely different than the platform of education in this country. Because this country, the education is constricted. And you're right, I mean, maybe with the University of California was perhaps the best model of free education that this country has ever had, and that's being destroyed systematically, right? But
For art especially.
in particular, but I mean, But the ego, I mean, do you know an artist that doesn't have an ego? I mean, does it, is not this, in this case, the ego of Boyce and the mythology of Boyce and the production of the image of Boyce it seems to me, it was integral to the movement of Boyce. Like, his ego is what propelled him to do what he did. And so I'm willing, this is me, I'm willing to weigh the scales of Boyce's ego against what I believe in the end he was able to accomplish. Because I think the good outweighs the narcissism of Boyce, because he was clearly a narcissist beyond all narcissists. Okay? But again, at least the project, even if we level the harshest critiques at Boyce, in the end, I would probably argue that he did it for something that mattered, as opposed to only the accumulation of wealth. So right now, the models of success are two things. You have to be famous and well-known, and you have to be successful in the auction houses, which are not tools of evaluation of ideas. Boyce seems to have represented something else. I could be wrong, but nonetheless, you know. Anybody else? Yes?
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you so much for your talk tonight. I was wondering if you could talk maybe a little bit about how Boyce has influenced your own work. Like, what inspirational aspects do you use the most?
Well, that's a difficult question, because I think inevitably Boyce has been misread. And so in the misreading of Boyce, there's lots of artists whom claim a Boycean influence. And as Linda suggested, I'm not sure that that's possible in the United States. So so I feel a little uncomfortable suggesting that I could have aspired to that, because I'm not sure that I have been able to do that myself. But if I were to make any argument that would be close to what you're asking me, I would simply suggest that my relationship to teaching and education would be as close as I could get to a Boycean proposition of teaching and education coinciding as one organism with making work, right? I've dedicated half of my life to teaching other people. And I've done it in as close a model as possible. I lecture constantly, where probably a more Saidian model, where like a representations of the intellectual. Said suggested that we as intellectuals and artists and writers and poets have a responsibility to stand in public places and to bring forward the most germane and most difficult questions of our time, and bring those forward in such a way that it makes the room uncomfortable. Because if you're not uncomfortable by looking at the art, and you're not uncomfortable listening to the discourse, then you've not communicated anything, or you've not challenged people's preconceptions of who and what they are and how they interface into the world. Now, that is not always possible, and it's not always a question of conflict or being provocative. It is a question of how that information is disseminated. So the closest I can say is teaching, because I believe in teaching, it's a difficult proposition in this country. It's a difficult proposition. So that would be the closest I could come to that as an answer. So, yes, sir.
I'm sorry. Maybe I've missed in the beginning. What was your personal? I mean, what were your encounters or personal?
My relationship? I was a student of Klaus Rinke, who was the protege of Boyce. He lived in Los Angeles for 2 years, and I was his student then. So I received Boyce, and I studied with Marcuse, and Michael Asher, and Baldessari, and all these people. But so I have this sort of West Coast conceptualism. I have the Frankfurt School, Marxism, and I have Rinke giving me Boyce directly. So I didn't learn Boyce from a book.
But did you encounter him?
No, I never met Boyce. No, that's unfortunate. But as I suggest, if indeed it's true that Rinke was his #1 student, I could not have gotten closer. I did not read about Boyce.
You had several #1 students.
No, of course, I know that. Yes, yes. I'm partial to Rinke, of course, you know. But yeah, but the point. I mean, you asked a good question that I didn't address. I did not learn about Boyce from a book.
Good.
I learned about Boyce from a human being, from a student of his. So word of mouth inflection, story, right? The personal nature of Boyce. That's a very different way to learn about somebody, right? It's not learning about somebody from a book, which is how we learn history, right? So that I think that substantively that's a different, that my interaction then is different, right?
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Daniel.
Thank you.